during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली जयपुर लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई एक सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information. On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's First Editions. We're delighted to launch Nic Low's latest book, Uprising, Walking the Southern Alps of New Zealand, published by Text Publishing Melbourne, Australia. Low's book intertwines his Ngāi, Tahu, and European New Zealander roots to present a narrative deeply rooted in his ancestors' connection to New Zealand's Southern Alps. Traditionally known as Kā Tiritiri-o-te-moana, the mountain range played a deep role in his culture's sense of identity and presented Low with an opportunity to explore current anxieties and conflicts of language, counterculture, and consumerism. Steeped in conversations with tribal leaders, family memoirs, and his understanding of his own journey through the mountain range, he unfurls a mediation on history, land, and the search for self. Nic divides his time between Melbourne and Christchurch. His writings on wilderness, technology, and race has been widely published and anthologized on both sides of the Tasman. His first book was Arms Race, a collection of speculative fiction shortlisted for the Readings and Steel Rudd Prize and named a New Zealander listener and Australian Book Review of the Year. He's co-director of the Word Christchurch Festival. Nic, welcome and congratulations. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'd love to hear what inspired you to create this book and to take this walk. And also, I do hope you're going to share some of the photographs that you took on your journey. Nic, over to you.
Nei rata mihi kia koutou. Friends, greetings, welcome Sanjoy. Thank you for the wonderful, warm introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, even if I'm only here virtually. What inspired me to write this, Uprising, my second book? I think it comes from the mix in my ancestry. So on my father's side, we are mountaineers, we are climbers, we are mountain people. On my mother's side, I am Ngāi Tahu, I am Māori. And I think of us as a coastal people. Now, I grew up knowing the stories from my father's side about the mountains, but as I got older and I got more interested in that Māori history, I thought there have to be stories of the mountains, of our mountains. And so I started asking around, started sniffing around, and I came to realize that there is an incredibly rich and detailed Māori history of the high Alps. And so over the course of about 7 years, I set out to retrace the footsteps of my ancestors, to find out all the old maps, the old oral maps, also using our tribe Ngāi Tahu's digital atlas, which is called Ka Huru Manu, to go on 15 separate journeys, crossing back and forth between the east and west coasts of the Te Waiponamu of the South Island, crossing back and forth between Ngāi Tahu history and European history, really telling the story of these landscapes and its history and the people, the ancestors, the gods, the goddesses that live in those environments. And along the way, I got to spend a lot of time with Aoraki, which is the mountain that you see there in that shot. That is our highest mountain in New Zealand, sometimes known as Mount Cook, if you have a kind of colonial frame of mind. We prefer Aoraki. We crossed some of the mighty rivers of the South Island, the rivers that flow from those mountains down to the plains. Obviously, when we're heading into the mountains, we're following those rivers up. There's my father, Jeff Low, who I got to go on one fabulous walk with. We spent 5 days in the hills together, traversing an ancestral route. He first took me into the mountains when I was very young, so it was a great pleasure over the course of this book to get to re-walk some of those trips with him now that I'm a little older myself. As part of this journey, I also had the opportunity of exploring some of the really high and wild parts of Kā Tiritiri-o-te-moana. So there you will see us trying to climb up into the clouds. You know, here is us getting into the high alpine. Some of my colleagues, Kaharoa and Donnell there, we're up paying our respects to Aoraki, the sacred ancestor mountain. One of my favorite spots here, and this is in the Waimakariri basin, where I camped out and explored some of the histories and stories. There used to be a giant eagle in the old days, if you believe the myth, that lived on that mountain. Now you can't spend on and off several years out in the mountains without getting rained on, without getting flooded out. So that was Bridget wading a flooded Milford track. There is my partner, the wonderful Lee Hopkinson, who also I met over the course of this book. There's a love story in there, I'll have you know. This is Haast Pass, Te Ore Pātea it's called, and my great-great-great-grandmother was taken as a prisoner and marched across that pass, obviously before the road was put in. So I retraced her journey as part of that. We climbed alpine peaks as part of this. We traversed through dense New Zealand bush. If any of you have seen Lord of the Rings, you'll know that what those mountains are like. So we were up there climbing those mountains, paying our respects. This is from the summit rocks on Aoraki, on our way up the highest mountain in New Zealand, which we're going to talk a little bit about later. There is a friend of mine, Dave, a relation of mine, trying to light a match in the rain, which is an inevitable part of spending a long time in the mountains. We also got to eat from the land as we went. And here's my brother, Tim. It was a great pleasure getting to spend time with him in the mountains. And on one of the journeys I did in the book, we actually tried to eat our way from one coast to the other to look at what traditional foodstuffs our ancestors harvested from the land. And this shot here, that's where we finished. That's Te Waiwai Bay, at the very south of Te Waipounamu, the South Islands. Now, it wasn't just walking. In the old days, we travelled on water as much as possible. So there are a lot of lakes in Kā Tiritiri-o-te-moana. So we arranged a whole lot of friends, family, to come down with twin-hulled canoes, and we paddled across those lakes. It's by far the quickest way to travel, rather than slogging your way through the bush, to just glide across the waters. And you'll see in the distance in that shot, there is Aoraki, there is the sacred mountain that our tribe, we bow our heads down to. That's the only person, the only presence in the landscape that we bow to, Aoraki, and you'll see us there paddling. And so there you have it, Uprising in 3 minutes, but obviously we're going to get into a fair bit more detail now.
Nic, thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating and stunningly visual. And I do hope when we visit Christchurch, you're going to take us through at least bits of that. Sort of Lord of the Rings revisited in some ways.
With great pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're delighted to launch Uprising, Walking the Southern Alps of New Zealand by Nic Low. In conversation today with the High Commissioner of New Zealand to India, His Excellency David Pine, author Nic Low discusses his alpine expedition and the story of his people. David Pine is New Zealand's High Commissioner to India. He is also High Commissioner Designate to Bangladesh and Ambassador Designate to Nepal. Pine is a seasoned diplomat who was New Zealand's High Commissioner to Malaysia and Brunei Darussalam from March 2011 to December 2014. And New Zealand's ambassador to the Philippines from 2006 to 2008. Prior to this, he had postings in New York, Canberra, Kuala Lumpur, and has been director of the Economic Division of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Pine took a break from the Foreign Ministry and advised top corporates and academic institutions from 2015 to 2019. And from 2018 to 2019, he was a chairperson of the Trade for All Advisory Board, where he advised the government on trade-related matters. Do remember, all our sessions that have been broadcast till now have been archived and are available on this site in the Mughal Tent venue, and also, of course, on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Ladies and gentlemen, First Editions now presents Uprising, Nic Low in conversation with His Excellency David Pine. David, over to you.
Dhanyavad Sanjoy. Namaste. When people imagine the South Pacific Islands, what pictures come to mind? A small place, tropical, maybe there are coral reefs and palm trees swaying in a gentle breeze. I'm not sure that places exactly like this exist outside of anyone's imagination. And as you've seen from the pictures already, certainly the South Pacific Island that we're going to be talking about today is nothing like that at all. It's actually quite large. It's a tad over 150,000 square kilometres. It's certainly not tropical. I suspect Nic will be putting on a pretty warm jacket when he leaves the studio to go home after our conversation. And it's mountainous. The Polynesian voyagers who discovered the island around 1,000 years ago, give or take a century or two, and became Maori on it, named the island Te Waiponamu, the waters of greenstone, after this precious stone that's abundant there. Nic's book, Uprising, takes us around the island and introduces us to the mountains that define, shape, and in some places segregate Te Waiponamu. But Nic isn't describing a wilderness, rather it's a place rich in story. And over the course of his 15 journeys, he talks to some of the inhabitants of this island and introduces us to them, past and present, including those who've traversed the mountains. Tēnā koe, Nic, tēnā koe. Before we introduce the book, let's talk a little about you. As you've mentioned, no mountaineer is going to get through life without some scary moments. And early on, you had a narrow escape from a fate worse than death. You almost became a lawyer. Tell us about that.
You're right. That could have been a fatal step in my life journey. I got interested in law because my mother is a lawyer, and she got interested in law because she is Ngāi Tahu, she is Māori, and there are very few Māori lawyers. And, you know, our people have not always had a good time of things, overrepresented in the courts, also a lot of land issues, land rights claims. So for her, it was an essential part of her career. It still is an essential part of her career. And so, of course, as her son, I got interested in that as well. But it was really the stories that interested me the most. It was the stories behind the cases. It was literature, it was writing, it was books. So at 4 years into my law degree, I thought, actually, it's more the storytelling that interests me. So I kind of took a swerve to one side and ended up going into literature, into creative writing, and really finding my feet as a writer, as an organizer of writing events. And I haven't really looked back.
And you've been forgiven?
I like to think so. I actually think secretly that my mum would prefer to be a writer than a lawyer, so maybe she's jealous.
and as has already been touched on with Sanjoy, mountaineering's on both sides of your family.
Yeah, so mountaineering on my dad's side, so my great uncle. So here in Canterbury, where I am currently, we have the Canterbury Mountaineering Club, but two of my great uncles were both presidents and patrons of the Canterbury Mountaineering Club. Jeff Harrow, one of those uncles, climbed with Sir Edmund Hillary, had some notable first ascents, and he and Derek, my other great uncle, passed their love of the mountains on to my father and his generation, and they passed them on to myself and my generation. So my brothers and I and our cousins are all really, we love the mountains. I feel my heart lift. I feel absolutely at home when I'm surrounded by those icy peaks. And I actually had a moment when I was in the Indian Himalaya a few years ago, and I had a similar joyous reaction to seeing your own magnificent mountains in that part of the world.
Yes, it's an obvious point of connection, isn't it, between the two countries? And you've touched on Hillary, who's an important person in connecting the two. You talked a little bit already to Sanjoy about what drove you to write the book, but I'd like to examine a bit more about what you were really trying to achieve in it and how you wanted people to use it.
Yeah, great question. So we have well over 500 kilometers in length of mountains. It's glaciers, it's rivers, it's forests. It's a spectacular landscape. And in many people's imagination, it is a wilderness. They see it as an untracked, unpeopled, unpopulated place. And I think one of my goals with writing this book was to really make people aware of just the richness of the history that was already there. It was not a wilderness at all. Now, Ngāi Tahu have what's called Ka Huru Manu, I touched on that earlier, which is our digital atlas. And it contains thousands upon thousands of pre-European place names. There are hundreds of those through the mountains, all the peaks named, the glaciers, a huge range of ancestors and stories that are associated with all of those places. So I really wanted to take that knowledge that was out there, that people held in their heads, that was on websites, that was in books, and take that knowledge for a walk. So to actually take it out into the landscape and think about what did it actually mean to live in and traverse these landscapes. And to try and, I guess my reasoning was, if I go deep enough, if I think hard enough, if I talk to enough people, can I walk into the past? Can I bring that past alive? And the intention is that by doing so, if I succeed in any even very small way, that readers here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and any visitors, once COVID has passed, once anyone who is visiting New Zealand actually goes out into those mountains, that they take the book with them and they actually read it in the places that I'm writing about. So, obviously you're not all going to want to climb mountains like this. Some of you will, though. There is something for everyone there. So to really go out into the hills, to read these stories, to understand the histories, so that when you look at those mountains, you're not seeing wilderness, you're seeing a place that's rich with story.
It's interesting when you say walking into the past. Nic, I've often heard Māori friends talking about walking backwards into the future. What do they mean by that?
That is a very good question, because there's a lot of debate. It's a phrase in Māori that it can be interpreted in a range of different ways. But the idea is, the way I understand it, the idea is that we know the past, we know our ancestors, we know what we call our whakapapa, our history and our connection to our ancestors. What has already gone before is visible to us. We are facing it. We are always looking at that past. But we're moving this way. We are going into the future. The future is unknown to us. We cannot see what is going to happen. So that is the direction we move in, but we are always looking back towards our roots and our ancestry and our whakapapa. That's my take on it. I've had people radically disagree with that, which is one of the great things about what we call whakatauki, these pithy little sayings that have many different interpretations.
You've talked quite a bit in the book about the importance of non-literary forms of history, oral history, maps, carving. Tell us about their role in Aotearoa.
Well, when Europeans first arrived, they found a culture that had deep knowledge of all of its roots going right back through Polynesia, the stories that we tell, the genealogies that we can recite, the knowledge that we brought with us across the Pacific has incredibly deep roots. We've been able to trace some of the stories that are told here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, right back through Polynesia over many thousands of years. And all of that is, of course, through oral traditions. So it is because of our oral knowledge that we've been able to keep these stories alive. And when it comes to navigation, when it comes to actually navigating a complex and at times quite dangerous landscape, you need good maps. And of course, those maps were oral maps. So one of the great pleasures of this book was sourcing, unearthing, digging out, really getting to grips with some of the early oral maps. So take, for example, the Waitaki River, which is one of our great rivers that flows from Aoraki all the way out to the sea. It's in the tribal area of Moiraki, Waihao, and Arowhenua, which are our traditional tribal bases in that area, and they hold the deep knowledge of that area. And they have an oral map that talks about the landscape. So but it's actually in the form of a genealogy. Now, bear with me, that might sound a little strange, a genealogy that is also a map, but this is how it works. So the oldest ancestor there is Aoraki, the great mountain that you guys will have seen in our introduction. Aoraki's brothers are there next to him, and then other relations, and then, so the genealogy that is recited comes from Aoraki down through the other mountains, through the lakes, through the rivers, going from hill to peak, all the way down and out to the coast. So it is on the one hand about the living connection that links us to our ancestors. To hear David Higgins, who's one of the great experts in this area, speak of it, he talks about how we, as the descendants of Aoraki, have our place in that landscape because we can trace our genealogies back to those mountains. Those genealogies also function as a map because the order in which those names are recited is the order in the landscape in which you will meet those features. So by knowing your history, by knowing your connection to the past, you also know the maps of the landscapes, and it allows you to navigate from place to place. So there's a beautiful richness to that, which on some of these walks I really tried to bring to life by actually retracing those oral maps.
You did touch on this digital atlas, and it sounds like a pretty impressive achievement. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, absolutely.
And also,
so I wonder
what it says about Ngāi Tahu's capabilities in the 21st century.
Absolutely. So I guess I should give a little bit of context here. So Ngāi Tahu as a tribe, there are about 67,000 registered members. And our headquarters, the tribe's headquarters, are here in Te Waipounamu in the South Island. This is our traditional area, divided into 18 bases. And through our treaty settlement process, so obviously under colonisation, and this is something we'll touch on a little bit later, Ngāi Tahu was dispossessed of the vast majority of our land. There's been a long process of redress through what we call the Waitangi Tribunal, where the best historians and lawyers on both sides present their evidence about what actually happened in the past. The Waitangi Tribunal found very, very strongly in Ngāi Tahu's favour that there were 10, what we call the 10 tall trees, that there were land sales that were not honoured by the Crown. And as part of the redress for that, Ngāi Tahu, a small amount of land, $170 million in cash, and a range of other resources were returned to Ngāi Tahu. Now, the tribal leadership has taken that and turned that into assets worth about $1.5 billion New Zealand dollars. So, as a tribe, Ngāi Tahu is in a strong position to actually bring to life the visions that our ancestors, that our elders have. And I should say that I don't speak for the tribe in any way. I'm merely just sort of bringing you up to speed with what's been happening. But Ngāi Tahu has its own archives team. The idea is that we should control our own heritage and our own history. And so Takare Norton is the head archivist at Ngāi Tahu. And with the kind of drive of a number of senior elders, has been over many, many years collecting together all the old place names, all the old maps, and taking them from oral forms, taking them out of manuscripts and out of archives, and putting them into a modern satellite atlas, which much of that is publicly available. So it's kahurumanu.co.nz. And we can perhaps post links to that later, but it's a way of just looking at that island at a glance and really seeing what it looked like in the old days.
Thanks, Nick. You describe yourself early on as a pretty rational sort of a person, but the book starts with a vision, with an apparition, really, or a mistake, depending on how you want to look at it. And I get a sense in the book that you're sort of reevaluating the limitations of reason and yeah, its limitations really. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm a rationalist and a skeptic by inclination. That's kind of, that would have been my default position. But one of the magical things about doing this book and going on all these adventures was my view on that got really challenged. And very early on in the piece, on the very first crossing that I did of the Southern Alps, I definitely had some kind of vision, and it was atop what we call Ngāi Raureka, otherwise known as Browning Pass, and I got caught in a storm, and I looked down into my pack and I was rummaging for a jacket to kind of protect myself against the elements, and I looked back up and the entire world had disappeared. All I could see was a kind of a smooth grey, black, silvery surface extending off into infinity, and it was a very surreal moment. It totally wrong-footed me, and a minute later it resolved, and I think what happened was that we have a type of cloud, a type of storm cloud that forms very close over the tops of the mountains that look like that, and I think I basically got swallowed by one of those clouds. But it did prompt a whole lot of thoughts and feelings about, how did my ancestors see these landscapes? And I might just read a little extract here that kind of speaks to some of the visions or the ideas that maybe were in evidence in the old days. I'd read early colonial accounts which said that old-time Maori feared the mountains. Lightning about the peaks could be an omen of death. Walls and towers of mist, so common and so substantial in the New Zealand mountains, were considered the fortresses of the Patupaia, the fairy people whose distant fires left no trace. A European geologist was guided most of the way up Mount Tongariro, but his guides refused to set foot in the snow. He wrote that to Maori, the mountains were peopled with mysterious and misshapen animals. The black points, which he sees from afar in the dazzling snow, are fierce and monstrous birds. A supernatural spirit breathes on him in the evening breeze. Diefenbach, the speaker there, and others were talking about specific sacred mountains. Every iwi and hapu, every tribe and sub-tribe has at least one local mountain that embodies the tribe's spirit. And these mountains stand as a living symbol of mana, of prestige and spiritual power. They're where your ancestors' bones are buried, and a touchstone in speech and song. The summits represent the head, the most sacred part of the body. It's no wonder that Diefenbach's guides wouldn't set foot on top of their sacred peak. But in Te Waipounamu, Ngāi Tahu have always lived in the shadow of high mountains. Our Alps are extensive, 5 times the area of the European Alps, and more than 2,000 peaks that rise to more than 2,000 meters high. Travel through the mountains was once relatively common, whether for trade, for pounamu gathering, family occasions, warfare, or the exchange of knowledge. Years after Raureka's journey, Raureka is the ancestor whose footsteps I was following on that journey. Years after her journey, this pass was made tapu, or sacred, when an avalanche wiped out members of a Ngāi Tahu war party. Up until then, it likely was not, even if the mountaintops on all sides were. I doubted an alpine crossing alone would have shattered Raureka's mind.
Thanks, Nic. You describe so well, I think, the tension between the ideas of climbing and exploring a mountain and living in harmony with it and a sense of reverence for it. And that's not something that's unique to Aotearoa, even across the Tasman Sea, where Aboriginal people live in such a flat land, they still have a reverent hesitancy about going to their peaks. Something to do, I think, with the tapu, sacred nature of the head, is it?
For us it is. For us it absolutely is. So the top of the head is tapu. It's the most sacred part of the body, and because we see our sacred mountains as ancestors, the very top of the head is of course not to be touched. And as a mountaineer, that poses something of a dilemma. Kia tuho koe mehe mau ka teite. That's the whakatauki where we say if you must bow your head, only bow to a lofty mountain. But of course, on my Pākehā side, on my European side, they're all mountaineers in the family, and the absolute point of it is to go right to the top and put your boots on top. And I wanted to explore that tension within myself. So what I did is I mounted an expedition to not climb Aoraki Mount Cook. Now, it's the highest mountain in the country. It's a fairly serious undertaking. And I thought, I'm going to go some of the way. I'm going to go most of the way. And at some point, I'm going to turn around. So would you like me to read a little bit?
Please do, yeah.
All right. So that I should say that, you know, a lot of this book is just travel and adventure. Like, there's a lot of history in here, but there's also a lot of great stories about just exploring the mountains, climbing, abseiling, glacier travel, all that sort of thing. So this is about 3/4 of the way up Aoraki. The climbing started in earnest with a couple of fast, calf-burning pitches up 60-degree snow, heading up Aoraki's immense torso. While Lewis led, I swung around in the belay to gaze on the tattooed faces of Aoraki's brothers, glowing lilac and rose. This was the moment of creation, repeated every day. A thin red slit cut the eastern horizon, and I mouthed the words of an ancestral chant. The small silver cup of the moon tilted to the north. The great ancestor's shoulder is also known as the summit rocks, a sequence of buttresses at the edge of the east face. Yesterday's storm had plastered them with ice. The exposure was superb and the climbing looked even better. We were approaching Aoraki's head with every step, but there was no way I was turning back, not yet. The rope came tight. On belay, Lewis yelled. My first axe went in with a solid thunk, and again my mind dissolved. I fitted my body to the contours and cracks and vertical steps and sequences dictated entirely by Aoraki himself. The ice and neve took each tool placement, first go, and I arrived at each belay grinning, and Lewis grinned back. There was no need to talk. One of the other guides, a powerful man named Alex, appeared over the lip below us and whooped with pleasure. Below him, the long silver ridge leading from Aoraki to Horoko'o, New Zealand's next highest peak, turned to fire with the first direct rays of sun. The white sweep of the Tasman Glacier glowed with a deep inner light. At 8 o'clock, 7 hours after we'd left the hut, Lewis and I reached the false summit, a small patch of flat ground above the summit rocks. Untracked snow swooped up to Aoraki's head. A final schrund divided us from the upper ice cap. The top was in reach. We unroped and sat down, and I bowed my head. So that's where I left it. That was as far as I went.
It's very vivid. I'm sure you're doing your bit for getting everyone down there post-COVID to climb. Before we sign off, I don't want anyone thinking that the diplomat in the conversation's trying to shield us away from some of the more difficult questions. It's a very hard thing, isn't it, to imagine an alternative history for Aotearoa. It's a history that took a different turn and didn't go down a colonial route. It's which I think neither of us would have been born into. But you've given some thought to this, Nic, and you've also given a lot of thought to how, even with the past that we carry, we can make a better future. And I'd just like to invite you to finish with some comments on both of those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that I really try and do with this book is get to grips with what it means to belong. What does it mean to belong to a place that you love? And if you're Maori, belonging is quite easy. Our ancestors were here. We descend from these landscapes. If you are Pākehā, if you are a more recent arrival, that question of how do you belong is a really pressing one. And when you take into consideration that colonial history, the mass dispossession of Maori, and what it, you know, the long-term repercussions of that have been very serious. And one of the things I try to think about in this book, and I suppose it's because I've previously written fiction, I use my imagination to try and imagine, what if things were different? You know, what if things had played out differently, or could things be different again in the future? What might the mountains and the high country look like if they were equitably shared, if the Crown had kept their end of the bargain? Where would we be today? So I just wanted to close with a vision of what the mountains might look like if Ngāi Tahu had retained control, if our people, so when the land was sold, our chiefs said we're going to reserve about 10% of the land from that sale, and that never happened. But I guess my vision is, what if that had happened? What would going into the outdoors, going into the mountains look like today? With 2 million acres of land and serious capital to develop it, Ngāi Tahu would, by now, have been an economic powerhouse for 7 generations. There would be thriving seasonal settlements beside all the inland lakes and rivers and wetlands, flashing past the window of your car every minute or two, with houses that were part traditional Māori whare, which is a traditional Māori house, and part alpine chalet. High country sheep stations would have carved wooden posts and gates out front, and generations of shearing gangs would sleep in Māori meeting houses beneath the peaks. There would be vast wetlands and forests supplying all of the traditional sources of food: weka, tuna, kakapo, kiore, and kiwi. We'd even be eating kiwi, to a thriving Māori and Pākehā middle class who would come up for weekends spent eeling or birding or storytelling or mountain biking, and of course tramping, which is what in New Zealand we call hiking. Tramping wouldn't just be from hut to hut or campsite to campsite, but it would be from mahika kai to mahika kai, which are the traditional food gathering places. Part of the joy of walking would be harvesting your own food along the way, and it would be common to meet large groups out on the trail, all wearing Gore-Tex and merino hiking gear with white buckets full of birds swinging from their hands. And the highlight of the trip, the thing that every child would look forward to for months, would be whitewater rafting back down to the coast on updated mōkihi, which are a type of whitewater raft that our ancestors used in the old days to ferry all the birds from the inland to the coast. Everyone would go out into the hills with their maps showing Māori and English names, and with a knowledge of the stories behind each one. And whereas in Europe you might look to ruined castles for a sense of history, here we would find history in the names and in the ground beneath our feet.
Well, Nic, that's a perfect place to finish. It's certainly a vision of New Zealand, of Aotearoa, that I would love my children and grandchildren to be able to participate in. Thanks very much for your kōrero today. Congratulations on the book. And back to you, Sanjoy.
Thank you so much, David Pine, and thank you, Nic Low. What does it mean to belong? I mean, the fascinating stories that you spun for us. I do hope that this book sells a zillion copies and everybody gets to hear, or at least sample, some of what you've been able to put together. I'm dying to get out there and walk, and thanks to David, hopefully that will happen sometime soon. But till then, take care. Thank you for everything. Thank you for the beautiful visions and the images. Ladies and gentlemen, please do stay logged on to watch our next session, The Sweet Indifference of the World, Peter Stam in conversation with Anjum Hassan. This will be presented here at 8:30 p.m. IST today. Till then, stay safe, stay double-masked. Nic Low and David Pine, thank you both very much for joining us on First Editions.
In these times, times during COVID, when we're all sitting at home, it's sort of like a ray of light that we get to watch these amazing sessions when we can't all be together. It certainly brightens up my evenings.
आज पेंडेमिक में हम डिजिटली जयपुर लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल कर रहे हैं और मुझे लगता है कि हमारे सामने श्रोता नहीं है, हम आपस में बात कर रहे हैं, लेकिन उस फील को, उस उमंग को महसूस कर सकते हैं कि हजारों लाखों लोग हमसे जुड़े हुए हैं, हमको सुन रहे हैं और कहीं ना कहीं कोई सार्थक हस्तक्षेप हो रहा है.
People who came online to view and listen to our incredible speakers from across the world, we were able to continue in our tradition of ensuring the free flow of knowledge and information.